So I've published on Amazon my new book, Fundamentals of Environmental Economics. It has 16 chapters, and I'm going to talk through, in 16 different videos, a preview of each of these chapters. So the first chapter of any textbook is always boring, and I was determined to not be guilty of that. So I start off the book with something that interested me, the fact that I've been teaching environmental economics for 22 years now. And I talk about the first time I taught it as I tortured undergraduates at the University of Chicago when I was an undergraduate. And I crack some jokes about an early textbook I wrote but never published. I guess Kinko's published it. And that 22 years later, after learning some lessons, I'm back trying again. I stress in the first chapter several ideas. First, I make the point that the goal of any economist is to explain and predict human behavior. And if we can do a good job of explaining and predicting human behavior, then our thinking can be useful for thinking about the intended and unintended consequences of government policy. We can actually be useful in predicting government policies that haven't been adopted yet. And as I tell my students, I always hope that policymakers are eager to hear from the economists, that when we think and when we conclude that a well-intended policy has ugly unintended consequences, that this reduces the likelihood that politicians actually adopt that policy. Unfortunately, I don't believe that's true. I think too often in Washington, D.C. and other capitals, economists tend to rubber stamp what politicians want to do rather than influencing the policy debate through our stunning empirical analyses. But again, it's our job as social scientists who aspire to be a science to explain and predict human behavior. And I think neoclassical economics does a pretty good job. I always claim we can explain and predict maybe 35% of human behavior, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I then talk about environmental economics, which is, of course, the focus of this book applied to urban economic issues. And what I speak about is that the starting point of environmental economics is that both firms and households and governments all have well-defined objectives, whether it's to maximize utility for households, maximize profit for firms, or maximize the probability of being reelected for government officials, and then use the environment to achieve their specific goals. And protecting the environment can sometimes offer benefits, but it also imposes costs. So the environment has several dimensions to it. It's the air and water, which of course, if we have access to clean air and clean water, this raises our day-to-day quality of life. It improves our health. It is aesthetically pleasing, and it raises our productivity. Think of some worker in outdoor Los Angeles. If the air is smoggy, that's going to be a less productive worker. At the same time, the environment's also a productive input. If we take trees or fish and we convert them into food or housing, that improves our quality of life. So with the environment and with natural resources, we face trade-offs of, do we use these scarce inputs to achieve our goals now? Do we save them and conserve them for future generations? We face a series of trade-offs. And since we face finite time and we have finite resources, we have every incentive to think hard about how to use our scarce resources. Notice that I just made an assumption. I assume that we, human beings, have the property rights over nature. And at my UCLA Institute of the Environment, that presumption offends many of my environmental science students. They sort of view us as symmetric to God's creatures, of don't we live in harmony with these creatures? Perhaps an ugly point of economics is this assumption that we, humans, decide the future for these creatures. We can knock them off right now, or we can allow them to continue to flourish and multiply, but that it's our choice. Midway through chapter 1, I present a letter from the New York Times where a guy in San Diego gives a bird's perspective on the challenges that bird faces because of people's actions near La Jolla in beautiful suburban San Diego. I then close chapter 1 with the defense of free markets. I remind the reader that I'm a free market environmentalist. I'm a supporter of both free markets and protecting the environment, and often these two are presented in sort of a caricature as being in a tension and in conflict. Throughout the book, I'm going to be telling you about we're going to continue to think about when does free market economic activity cause environmental challenges versus when does it mitigate those challenges. And of course, our focus will be incentives, the incentives of households, governments, and firms to take into account the consequences of their environmental actions and to conserve on natural resource consumption. And throughout this book, like in any economics book, incentives, incentives, incentives. And if we haven't introduced those incentives, why not? And if we have introduced incentives, how effective will they be in reducing driving, reducing electricity consumption, reducing water consumption? What is the shape of demand curves for these various objects? And that's the job of an applied economist to measure. And we'll be coming back to that as well. And I'll have more to say in Chapter 2, which I'll record soon.